She showed kindness to a stranger. Then learned he was the cold duke she'd marry, 1895. The November rain came down in sheets across Fifth Avenue, turning the cobblestones into mirrors that reflected the gas lamps flickering to life in the gathering dusk. Clara Whitmore pressed herself against the awning of Stewart's department store, her worn coat doing little against the cold that seeped through the fabric. She watched the carriages roll past, their wheels splashing through puddles, the wealthy passengers inside, warm and dry behind curtained windows. At 23, Clara had grown accustomed to being invisible to that world, a shop girl who mended lace and hemmed silk for ladies who never looked her in the eye. Before we continue with Clara's story, I'd love to invite you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this tale of unexpected love in Gilded Age New York. And please, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. She was about to make a run for the streetcar when she noticed him. A man collapsed against the brick wall of the alley beside the store, his fine wool overcoat soaked through, one hand pressed to his ribs. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against the grey fabric. Clara's breath caught. Everything in her practical nature screamed to walk away, to not get involved with whatever violence had brought a gentleman to this state. But her father's voice echoed in her memory. "We help those who need it, Clara. That's what decent people do." She hurried to his side, kneeling in the dirty water without thinking of her skirt. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with sharp features and dark hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes, when they opened, were a startling grey, cold and assessing even in his obvious pain. "Leave me," he said, his voice rough but commanding. "This doesn't concern you. You're bleeding. You need a doctor." Clara fumbled with the strings of her reticule, pulling out her carefully folded handkerchief, one of the few nice things she owned, with her initials embroidered in blue thread. She pressed it against his side before he could protest. "Where are you hurt? What happened?" "Thieves. They wanted my watch." He tried to push himself upright and nearly collapsed. Clara caught him, surprised by the solid weight of him. "I fought back. Foolish of me." "Can you stand? My boarding house is 6 blocks from here. Mrs. Chen, the landlady, she knows some medicine. We can get you there." Clara glanced around nervously. The streets were emptying as the rain intensified, and she knew from experience that help wouldn't come from those who remained. Not for a bleeding stranger in an alley, not in this part of the city where survival meant keeping your head down. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was measuring her worth, calculating whether she could be trusted or was part of some larger scheme. Then he nodded, just once. "Very well, but we must go now. They may return with others." Getting him to the boarding house took every ounce of Clara's strength. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, and though he tried to support his own weight, he stumbled frequently. They moved through the rain-slicked streets like shadows, Clara supporting him as best she could, while he kept one arm wrapped around his ribs. Passers-by gave them wide berth. A bleeding gentleman and a working-class girl made for the kind of scandal people pretended not to see. Mrs. Chen met them at the door, her weathered face creasing with concern. The elderly Chinese woman had run the boarding house on Mulberry Street for 30 years, taking in seamstresses and factory workers who had nowhere else to go. She asked no questions, just helped Clara maneuver the stranger up the narrow stairs to Clara's tiny room on the 3rd floor. "Lay him on the bed," Mrs. Chen instructed in her precise English. "I'll fetch my needles and herbs. This one needs stitching." Clara's room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small trunk where she kept her few possessions. The window looked out over the street, and rain pattered against the glass as she helped the stranger out of his ruined coat. Beneath it, his shirt was torn and bloody. When she peeled back the fabric, she found a knife wound along his ribs. Deep but not mortal, thank God. "What's your name?" she asked, as she brought water from the washstand to clean the wound. "Does it matter?" His voice had turned distant, as if he'd retreated somewhere behind those cold, grey eyes. "I'm Clara Whitmore. And yes, it matters. I'd like to know whose life I'm saving." She wrung out the cloth and dabbed at the blood. Trying to be gentle, despite his obvious attempt to remain stoic, he barely flinched. "Alexander." He paused, something flickering across his face. "Alexander Ashford." The name meant nothing to Clara, but she noticed the fine quality of his clothing, the gold cufflinks at his wrists, the subtle smell of expensive cologne beneath the blood and rain. "Well, Mr. Ashford, you picked a dangerous place to fight thieves." "I didn't pick it, they did." He watched her work with an intensity that made her hands shake slightly. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be anyone." "That's exactly why I'm helping you. You could be anyone, and everyone deserves basic human kindness. My father was a Methodist minister. He taught me that compassion isn't conditional on knowing someone's character first." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Though, I'll admit, I'm hoping you're not a murderer or something equally terrible." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Not a murderer. You have my word on that, at least." Mrs. Chen returned with her medical supplies, and for the next hour, Clara assisted as the landlady stitched Alexander's wound with practiced efficiency. He bore it without complaint, though Clara saw the tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on the bed frame. When it was finished, Mrs. Chen bandaged the wound with clean strips of cotton and studied their patient with the same shrewd assessment she gave everyone. "You stay the night," she told Alexander, her tone brooking no argument. "Tomorrow, when rain stops, you go. But tonight, you rest. Clara will watch over you, make sure fever doesn't come." After Mrs. Chen left, Clara settled into the wooden chair by the bed, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She knew she should change, but something about the way Alexander watched her made her self-conscious. He'd turned his head toward her, those grey eyes still alert, despite the laudanum Mrs. Chen had given him for the pain. "You should rest," Clara said quietly. "The medicine will help you sleep." "I don't want to sleep, not yet." He shifted slightly, wincing. "Tell me about yourself, Clara Whitmore. You work at Stewart's." "I do. I'm a seamstress in the alterations department. I've been there 5 years since my father died, and I came to the city." She twisted her hands in her lap. "It's not glamorous work, but it's honest." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 12. It was just my father and me after that, in a small parish in Vermont. When he passed, there was nothing left. He'd given everything to the church and his congregation. I came here because I could sew, and Mrs. Donnelly, the head seamstress, knew my mother from when they were girls together." Clara paused. "Why am I telling you all this? You're a complete stranger." "Perhaps because I'm a complete stranger. Sometimes it's easier to speak honestly to someone who has no stake in your life." Alexander's eyes had begun to drift closed, despite his resistance. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore, for your kindness. It's been a long time since anyone showed me such uncomplicated decency." Clara watched as sleep finally claimed him, his breathing deepening into a steady rhythm. She allowed herself to study him properly now. The aristocratic lines of his face, the expensive cut of his hair, the calluses on his hands that suggested he wasn't entirely the idle gentleman she'd assumed. There was something about him that didn't quite fit, a contradiction she couldn't name. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the city, and Clara pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders, settling in for a long night of watching over a man whose real name she suspected wasn't Alexander Ashford at all. She woke to grey morning light filtering through the window and the realization that her patient was awake and watching her. Clara straightened in the chair, her neck aching from the awkward position she'd slept in. "How do you feel?" "Better. The pain is manageable." Alexander sat up slowly, testing his injury. The colour had returned to his face, and his eyes seemed sharper, more calculating than they had been the night before. "I should go. I've imposed on you long enough. Mrs. Chen said to check your bandages first. Let me see." Clara moved to his side, and he allowed her to unwrap the dressing. The wound looked clean, no signs of infection, the stitches holding firm. As she worked, she became acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his skin, the way he held perfectly still, as if accustomed to being attended to. "You're very skilled at this," he observed. "I sew wedding gowns and ball gowns for the wealthiest families in New York. Compared to that, basic wound care isn't so difficult." Clara rewrapped the bandage with efficient movements. "There, keep it clean and dry. Come back in a week to have the stitches removed. Mrs. Chen will do it for a quarter." Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, extracting several bills. "For your trouble. And Mrs. Chen's supplies." Clara stared at the money. More than she made in a month. "I can't accept that. I didn't help you for payment." "I know. But you lost work yesterday and you used your own materials. Consider it compensation for that, if not gratitude." He pressed the bills into her hand. "Please, it would ease my conscience." Against her better judgment, Clara accepted $2 and returned the rest. "This is more than enough. Thank you, Mr. Ashford." Something flickered in his expression. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. "Miss Whitmore, there's something you should know." A sharp knock interrupted him. Mrs. Chen opened the door, her eyes wide with alarm. "Clara, there are men downstairs. Very fine gentlemen. They say they're looking for someone. A missing person." Alexander's face went carefully blank. "It seems I've been found." He stood, moving with only slight difficulty. "Miss Whitmore, I apologize for the deception. My name is Alexander Ashford, as I said, but I'm not. That is, my full name is Alexander Ashford Bancroft, the Duke of Bancroft." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The Duke of Bancroft, one of the wealthiest men in America, heir to a railroad fortune that had shaped the expansion of the entire Western territories. She'd read about him in the society pages, the cold, ruthless businessman who'd taken over his father's empire at age 25 and doubled its worth in 5 years. The man they called the Iron Duke for his complete lack of sentimentality in business dealings. But that's impossible. Why would you—" Clara couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't reconcile the bleeding stranger in the alley with the man whose engagement to Millicent Vanderbilt had been announced in every newspaper in the country just last month. "I needed to escape. For just one night I needed to be away from all of it." Alexander, the Duke, reached for his ruined coat. "But reality has a way of finding us, doesn't it? Miss Whitmore, I cannot adequately express what your kindness has meant to me. But I must ask one more favor. When people ask about last night, as they inevitably will, please tell them you found me injured and brought me here. Nothing more. The details of our conversation, your name, those should remain between us." "Why?" Clara whispered. "What are you protecting me from?" "My world, Miss Whitmore. It's not kind to people like you. People who show genuine compassion without calculation. If certain individuals knew you'd helped me, they might use that against you, or against me." He paused at the door, something like real regret crossing his features. "Goodbye, Clara. I wish circumstances were different." Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, and Clara was left standing in her tiny room with $2 clutched in her shaking hand, and the certain knowledge that her life had just intersected with forces she couldn't possibly understand. 3 weeks passed before Clara saw Alexander again. They were the strangest weeks of her life, filled with a restless energy she couldn't name. She threw herself into her work at Stewart's, hemming trousseau items for Miss Vanderbilt's upcoming wedding to the Duke of Bancroft in January. The bride-to-be came for fittings, surrounded by her mother and a gaggle of society friends, and Clara kept her head down, her needle flying through silk and satin, while the ladies discussed the Duke's cold demeanor and whether Miss Vanderbilt would be able to soften him. "They say he's never smiled in public," one of the friends whispered loudly. "Not once since his father died. He's all business, no heart." "Millicent will change that," Mrs. Vanderbilt said with iron certainty. "A good wife can civilize any man, and the alliance between our families will be the most powerful in the country. That's what matters." Clara said nothing, but she thought about the man who'd watched her with something like loneliness in his eyes, who'd thanked her for uncomplicated kindness. That man hadn't seemed heartless. Guarded, certainly, but not the cold automaton the society pages described. December brought the first real snow, transforming the city into something almost beautiful. Clara was leaving Stewart's through the employee entrance when she saw him, standing across the street beside a black carriage, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Their eyes met, and he tilted his head slightly, a clear invitation. Every rational thought told her to walk away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to catch the streetcar and return to her safe, predictable life. But Clara had never been entirely rational, especially when her curiosity was aroused. She crossed the street, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. "Miss Whitmore." Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something warmer. "I was hoping I might speak with you. Would you join me for a short drive? I promise to return you safely to your boarding house." "Your Grace," Clara said, testing out the formal address. It felt strange on her tongue. "I don't think it would be appropriate for me to—" "Please, there's something I need to say to you. Something I couldn't say before." His gloved hand reached out, not quite touching her arm. 10 minutes. That's all I ask." Against her better judgment, again, Clara allowed him to hand her into the carriage. The interior was warm and luxurious, with velvet seats and brass fittings that gleamed in the lamplight. Alexander sat across from her, maintaining a proper distance, but the small space felt intimate nonetheless. "How is your injury?" Clara asked, unsure how else to begin. "Nearly healed, thanks to you and Mrs. Chen's excellent care." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've thought about that night often, about what you said regarding kindness not being conditional. It's been weighing on me." "Why?" "Surely as a duke. That's precisely why. In my world, kindness is always conditional, always transactional. Every dinner invitation, every friendly overture, every smile, they all come with expectations attached. People want access to my wealth, my influence, my connections. They want to use me or be seen with me or marry their daughters to me." His jaw tightened. "You were the first person in years who helped me simply because I needed help, who asked for nothing in return." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I did accept your money. Only after I insisted, and even then you took far less than I offered." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Miss Whitmore, Clara, I find myself in an unusual position. I would like to know you better, as a friend. Nothing more complicated than that. Would you allow me to call on you? Perhaps we could walk in Central Park, or I could show you some of the city's art galleries." Every sensible fibre of Clara's being screamed that this was dangerous, that a duke and a seamstress had no business being friends, that his engagement made any relationship between them inappropriate at best, scandalous at worst. But there was something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, that made her hesitate. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you want to be friends with someone like me? I'm nobody. I have nothing to offer you." You have everything to offer me: honesty, genuine conversation, a perspective unclouded by ambition or society's expectations. Alexander's voice dropped lower. I'm marrying Miss Vanderbilt in January. It's been arranged since we were children, a merger of two great families. She's a lovely woman, accomplished and suitable in every way. But when I'm with her, I feel like I'm playing a part in someone else's story. When I was with you that night, bleeding and half-conscious in your room, I felt more real than I have in years. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. Your Grace, we can't. Your engagement. I'm not proposing anything inappropriate. I'm asking for friendship, for someone to talk to who sees me as a man rather than a title or a fortune. Is that so impossible? It should have been impossible. Clara knew that. But she found herself nodding, watched his face transform with what might have been relief or joy or something equally dangerous. One walk. That's all I'm agreeing to. And if anyone sees us, they'll see a duke being kind to a young woman who once did him a service, nothing more. Alexander sat back, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. A real smile that softened his sharp features and made him look years younger. Thank you, Clara. You won't regret this. But as the carriage rolled through the snowy streets toward Mulberry Street, Clara suspected she already did. Their first walk in Central Park took place on a bright Saturday afternoon in mid-December, when the winter sun turned the snow-covered landscape into something from a fairy tale. Alexander arrived at the boarding house in civilian clothes rather than his usual formal attire, and with his collar turned up and a simple wool scarf wrapped around his neck, he could almost pass for an ordinary gentleman rather than one of the country's wealthiest men. Mrs. Chen watched them depart with knowing eyes, saying nothing but pressing a small package of almond cookies into Clara's hands. For your walk, she said simply, and Clara understood the unspoken message. Be careful. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. They walked the winding paths through the park, their breath misting in the cold air, while Alexander told her about his childhood, a lonely one spent in vast mansions where he saw his parents only at formal dinners and learned early that emotions were weaknesses to be suppressed. His father had groomed him to take over the Bancroft Empire with ruthless efficiency, teaching him that business was warfare by other means and that sentiment would destroy everything they'd built. Did you love him? Clara asked. Your father? Alexander was quiet for a long moment. I respected him. I feared him. I'm not certain I knew him well enough to love him. He died 3 years ago, and sometimes I still wake up expecting to hear his voice telling me I've made another mistake. Clara shared her own history, the small Vermont parish where her father had preached love and forgiveness to farmers and mill workers, the simple joy of community suppers and Christmas pageants, the devastating loneliness after he'd passed, and she'd realized the life she'd known was gone forever. She told him about the early days in New York, sleeping 3 to a room with other girls from Stewart's, learning to navigate a city that was both thrilling and terrifying. I used to dream of becoming a designer, she admitted, creating my own gowns, having my own shop, but that takes capital and connections, neither of which I have. So I hem other people's dreams instead. Why can't you still do it? Alexander asked. Build your own business? Because I'm a woman with no family name and no money. Banks won't lend to someone like me. And even if they did, who would patronize a shop run by a former nobody from Mulberry Street? Clara shook her head. It's a nice fantasy, but it's not realistic. What if someone invested in you, provided the initial capital and connections? Clara stopped walking, alarm bells ringing in her head. Your Grace. Alexander. When we're alone, please call me Alexander. Alexander, I can't accept money from you. People would assume they'd think I was my friend, which is what you are. But even as he said it, something flickered in his expression that suggested the word friend didn't quite encompass what he felt. Forget I mentioned it. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. They walked on in silence for a while, and Clara tried to sort through the tangle of her emotions. The truth was, she looked forward to their meetings with an intensity that frightened her. In the past 2 weeks, they'd met 4 times. Walks in the park, a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where Alexander had explained the paintings with surprising passion, an afternoon at a small cafe where they'd talked for hours over coffee and pastries. Each time, she found it harder to remember why this was dangerous. Each time, she noticed more about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he really laughed, the unconscious grace of his movements, the sharp intelligence that saw through pretense to truth. And each time, she felt guiltier about Millicent Vanderbilt, the unwitting woman who would marry a man in love with someone else, because Clara was no longer naive enough to pretend that's not what this was. Alexander might call it friendship, but the way he looked at her, the way his hand lingered when helping her over icy patches, the way his voice softened when speaking her name, those weren't the actions of a man seeking merely companionship. "Tell me about Miss Vanderbilt," Clara said abruptly. "What is she like?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Why do you want to know?" "Because in 3 weeks you're going to marry her, and I need to understand what kind of woman I'm—" She couldn't finish. What was she? Not a rival, certainly, not someone with any claim on him. "Millicent is everything a man in my position should want. She's beautiful, well-educated, socially accomplished. Our families have been planning this union since we were children. It makes perfect sense on paper." Alexander stared at the frozen lake ahead of them. "She doesn't love me. I don't love her. We both understand this is a business arrangement. She'll get the prestige of being a duchess and unlimited access to the Bancroft fortune for her charitable works. I'll get—" He trailed off. "What will you get?" "An appropriate wife, sons to inherit the empire, social stability." He turned to face her, and Clara caught her breath at the raw emotion in his eyes. "Everything I'm supposed to want, everything that means absolutely nothing." "Then don't marry her," Clara whispered. "It's not that simple. Our engagement was announced months ago. The wedding preparations are complete. 500 guests have been invited. If I jilted her now, it would be a scandal that would damage both our families. Millicent would be humiliated publicly." Alexander reached out and took Clara's hand, his grip desperate. "I'm trapped, Clara. I've been trapped since the day I was born into this life. And meeting you has only made me realize how much I've lost by fulfilling everyone else's expectations." Clara pulled her hand away, her heart breaking. "We can't see each other anymore. This has to stop. I won't be the reason you betray your obligations. I won't be responsible for hurting an innocent woman." "Clara, no. Listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. You're confusing gratitude and loneliness with something else. In a few months you'll be settled into your marriage and you'll realize this was just a moment of cold feet. A last grasp at freedom before assuming your responsibilities." Clara forced herself to step back, to create physical distance between them. "Go home, marry Miss Vanderbilt, build the life you're meant to have, and forget about a seamstress from Mulberry Street who once showed you kindness." She turned and walked away before he could respond, before she could see his reaction, before she could change her mind. The snow had started falling again, soft flakes that melted on her heated cheeks, and Clara told herself they weren't tears, that she wasn't crying for something that had never really existed in the first place. But that night, alone in her room, she let herself weep for the impossible thing she wanted and the inevitable future she couldn't change. The week before Christmas brought a cold snap that froze the city solid. Clara threw herself into finishing the final touches on Miss Vanderbilt's wedding trousseau, her fingers flying through delicate embroidery that would grace the undergarments of a woman marrying the man Clara couldn't stop thinking about. The irony wasn't lost on her. She hadn't seen Alexander since their last conversation in the park. She'd expected relief, maybe even peace at having done the right thing. Instead, she felt hollow, as if some essential part of herself had been carved away and left bleeding. She went through her days mechanically, sewing and sleeping and eating without tasting anything, while Mrs. Chen watched her with concern and said nothing. On Christmas Eve, Clara was preparing to attend midnight services at the Methodist church near the boarding house, a tradition her father had loved, when a messenger arrived with a package. Inside was a book, a leather-bound volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry, with a note in Alexander's angular handwriting tucked inside. "Clara, I cannot forget, as you asked, but I can respect your wishes and stay away. This book belonged to my mother. It was the only thing she owned that my father didn't buy for her. She brought it from England when she married, and she used to read from it when she thought no one was listening. I want you to have it, as a reminder that beauty and truth exist, even in gilded cages. May your Christmas be filled with the genuine joy you've shown me is possible. A." Clara held the book to her chest and wept. She didn't see the man watching from across the street, his collar turned up against the wind, his grey eyes tracking her movements through the boarding house window. Didn't know that Alexander had posted himself there like a sentinel, unable to stay completely away, but honouring her request for distance. Didn't realize that he remained until long after midnight, watching the light in her window and wondering how he'd lost control of his carefully ordered life so completely. The wedding was set for January 15th at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and as the date approached, all of New York society talked of nothing else. Clara found herself obsessively reading the society pages, torturing herself with details about the ceremony, the reception at the Vanderbilt mansion, the honeymoon trip to Europe. She told herself she was morbidly curious, nothing more. That once the wedding happened, she could finally move on. On January 10th, 5 days before the wedding, Clara was summoned to the head seamstress's office at Stewart's. Mrs. Donnelly looked uncomfortable, twisting her hands in her apron in a way that sent warning bells through Clara's mind. "Miss Whitmore, I've had an unusual request. Miss Vanderbilt has asked specifically for you to attend her on her wedding day. She wants you to help her dress and be available for any last-minute adjustments." Mrs. Donnelly paused. "It's a great honor, but also unusual. She said you've done such beautiful work on her trousseau that she trusts only you to see her down the aisle properly." Clara felt sick. Of all the cruelties fate could devise, this seemed particularly pointed. To dress the woman who would marry Alexander, to be present at the moment Clara lost him forever, it was too much. But she couldn't refuse without drawing attention to herself. Without raising questions, she couldn't answer. "Of course," she heard herself say. "I'd be honored to serve Miss Vanderbilt on her special day." The 5 days until the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. Clara barely slept, her mind churning with memories of Alexander's smile, his voice, the way he'd looked at her in Central Park, as if she were something precious and rare. She tried to pray for strength, for acceptance, for the ability to release something that had never truly been hers. But the words felt hollow, empty recitations that brought no comfort. On the morning of January 15th, Clara arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion on 5th Avenue before dawn. The house was already a hive of activity, servants rushing about with flowers and food, musicians tuning their instruments, family members barking orders. Clara was shown to Miss Vanderbilt's chambers, where the bride sat at her vanity in a silk robe, staring at her reflection with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Millicent Vanderbilt was a striking woman, tall and elegant, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. She studied Clara for a long moment, and something in her gaze made Clara deeply uneasy. "I wanted you here specifically because there's something I need to tell you, something I suspect you should know before I become the Duchess of Bancroft." Clara's mouth went dry. "Miss Vanderbilt, Please, don't insult my intelligence by pretending ignorance." Millicent's voice was calm but firm. "I know about your friendship with Alexander. My father's investigators have been following him for months. He suspected Alexander might have cold feet, might try to escape the engagement somehow. They documented your meetings in the park, your visit to the museum, everything." The room tilted. Clara gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "I swear to you, nothing inappropriate happened. We only talked. I told him to honor his commitment to you, to forget about me. I know, I've read the reports." Millicent stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street. "My father wants to use this information to control Alexander after we're married, to have leverage over him so the Vanderbilt interests always take precedence in business matters. That's how my family operates, through secrets and manipulation." "Why are you telling me this?" "Dart, because I don't want to marry a man in love with someone else. And because, unlike my father, I actually believe people should have choices." Millicent turned back to Clara, her expression resolute. "I'm not going to marry Alexander today. I'm calling off the wedding." Clara felt the words like a physical blow. "You can't. The scandal, your reputation, will survive. I'll tell everyone the truth, that I realized I couldn't marry a man whose heart belonged to another. Society will be shocked. My father will be furious, but I'll recover. Women have survived worse." Millicent smiled slightly. "And honestly, I'm relieved. I've been having my own doubts about this marriage. There's a man, a second son with no fortune and no prospects, who I've loved for years. This gives me the excuse I needed to follow my own heart instead of my family's ambitions. But Alexander, the agreement between your families can go to hell." Millicent crossed to Clara and took her hands. "Listen to me. In about an hour, this household is going to descend into chaos. When it does, I want you to go to Alexander. Tell him what I've said. Tell him he's free, and then let him make his own choice about what happens next. Miss Vanderbilt, I can't. This isn't—" "Yes, you can. And it is." Millicent squeezed Clara's hands. "Life is too short to marry for duty when you could marry for love. My mother did it, and she's been miserable every day of her 40-year marriage. I won't repeat her mistakes. Now go, before anyone realizes you were here." Clara fled the mansion in a daze, her mind reeling. The snow had started again, thick flakes that obscured the morning sun, and she stumbled through the streets without a clear destination. Free. Alexander was free, but that changed nothing. Did it? The gulf between their worlds still existed. The impossibility of a duke and a seamstress building a life together remained unchanged. She found herself at Central Park, at the bench where they'd sat together weeks ago, where he'd told her about his trapped life, and she'd told him to forget her. The park was empty in the early morning snowfall, silent and pristine, and Clara sat down without caring that her coat would get soaked. "I thought I might find you here." Alexander's voice made her jump. He stood a few feet away, snowflakes catching in his dark hair, his expression guarded but hopeful. "Millicent sent word to me an hour ago. She told me what she said to you." "You should go back," Clara whispered. "Try to talk her out of this madness. Your families, the scandal. Let there be a scandal. Let the families be furious. I'm done living for everyone else's expectations." Alexander moved closer, his eyes searching hers. "Clara, when I met you in that alley, bleeding and desperate to escape my own life, I didn't expect to find anything more than momentary respite. I certainly didn't expect to find the one person who could make me believe there was more to existence than duty and empire building. But that's what you've done. You've shown me that genuine connection is possible, that I'm capable of feeling something beyond calculated indifference. You're confused, you're grateful, I'm in love with you. The words hung in the frozen air between them, stark and undeniable. I've known it since that first walk in the park, when you told me about your father and your dreams, and I realized I wanted to hear every thought you'd ever had. When you told me to stay away, to marry Millicent, it nearly killed me, but I did it because you asked, because your happiness mattered more than my own desires. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the pounding of her heart and the impossible words he'd just spoken. Alexander, this can't work. I'm a seamstress. You're a duke. Your world would never accept me. Then we'll create our own world. He dropped to one knee in the snow, heedless of the wet and cold, and pulled a small velvet box from his coat. Clara Whitmore, I know this is sudden. I know there are 1,000 practical reasons why you should refuse. But I'm asking anyway because I can't go back to a life without you in it. Will you marry me? Not because it makes sense, not because society expects it, but because we choose each other freely and completely. Clara stared at the ring. A simple gold band with a modest diamond, nothing like the ostentatious jewels society expected a duke to give, and felt tears stream down her face. What about your empire? Your responsibilities? The Bancroft legacy? We'll continue with you beside me. Or won't continue if that's what you choose. Clara, I've spent my entire life building an empire I never wanted, fulfilling expectations I never agreed to. If loving you means losing all of it, then I'll consider it a fair trade. You say that now, but in 5 years, I'll still love you. In 10 years, in 50 years. However long I'm given, I want to spend it with the woman who showed kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return. Alexander's voice cracked slightly. Please, say yes. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that this is real. Clara thought about her father, about what he would have said in this moment. She thought about Mrs. Chen and her simple wisdom about life being too short for regrets. She thought about all the dreams she'd put aside because they seemed impossible, and all the joy she'd denied herself because it seemed impractical. And then she stopped thinking and let herself feel the love that had been building since that rainy November night, the hope that maybe impossible things could happen, the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that choosing happiness wasn't selfish, but necessary. Yes, she whispered, God help us both, but yes. Alexander surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a desperation that spoke of all the restrained moments between them, all the careful distance they'd maintained, all the longing they'd tried to suppress. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his coat, tears and snow mingling on both their faces. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Thank you, he said simply, for saving my life twice. I only saved it once, and rather poorly at that, Clara said, laughing through her tears. You saved it the night you found me bleeding in an alley, and you saved it again just now by agreeing to share it with me. Alexander cupped her face in his hands. Whatever comes next, whatever scandal or difficulty we face, we'll face it together. I promise you that. They stood together in the falling snow, two people from impossibly different worlds who'd found in each other something worth risking everything for, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that she finally recognized as peace. The scandal was, predictably, enormous. By noon, on what should have been Alexander's wedding day, every newspaper in New York was shouting headlines about the jilted duke and the mystery woman who'd supposedly bewitched him. Millicent handled it with grace, telling reporters that she'd realized she couldn't marry a man in love with another and that she wished the Duke well. Her father raged and threatened, but Millicent stood firm, and within weeks she'd quietly announced her own engagement to Mr. James Harrison, a second son with limited means, but by all accounts a kind heart. The Bancroft family was less forgiving. Alexander's mother, a cold, brittle woman who'd been conspicuously absent from his life, sent a letter disowning him unless he came to his senses and found an appropriate bride. His uncles and cousins threatened legal action to seize control of the empire. The society matrons who'd once courted his favor now cut him dead at social functions. Alexander took it all with the same calm resolve he'd once applied to business negotiations. He hired lawyers to protect his interests, restructured the company to consolidate his control, and made it clear he would not be bullied into abandoning the woman he loved. Within 3 months, most of the challenges to his authority had been quietly settled, and the gossip had moved on to fresher scandals. Clara navigated her new reality with determination and grace. She refused to hide who she was or pretend to be something she wasn't. When society ladies snubbed her, she held her head high and remembered her father's lessons about dignity being an internal quality, not something bestowed by others. When the newspapers called her a gold digger and a social climber, she ignored them and focused on building a genuine partnership with Alexander. They were married in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church near Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with only a handful of people present: Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Donnelly, a few of Clara's fellow seamstresses, and Alexander's business attorney, who'd proven unexpectedly loyal. Millicent Vanderbilt sent a generous gift and a note wishing them well. Alexander's family sent nothing, which Clara thought was probably for the best. The early months of their marriage were both challenging and joyful. They faced social ostracism together, learning to find satisfaction in their own company rather than society's approval. Alexander taught Clara about business and finance, surprised and delighted to discover she had a natural aptitude for both. Clara taught Alexander about community and connection, introducing him to the world of working-class New York that existed entirely separate from his privileged upbringing. 6 months after their wedding, Clara opened her own design shop, Whitmore Designs, funded by Alexander, but run entirely on her own vision and effort. She created beautiful, well-made clothing at prices working women could afford, while also offering custom pieces for the few society ladies brave enough to patronize a shop run by the scandalous Duchess of Bancroft. The business grew slowly but steadily, building a reputation for quality and fairness. Alexander, freed from the expectation that he maintained an emotionless facade, proved to be a natural reformer. He restructured the Bancroft Railroad empire to prioritize worker safety and fair wages, scandalizing his industry peers, but earning loyalty from his employees that translated into increased productivity and profits. He established schools and hospitals in the communities his railroad served, using his wealth to create lasting positive change rather than merely accumulating more power. Together, they built a life that looked nothing like what either of them had imagined, but everything like what they needed. They bought a modest brownstone in a respectable but not ostentatious neighborhood, where Clara kept chickens in the small backyard, and Alexander helped her plant a vegetable garden in the spring. They entertained a hodgepodge of guests that scandalized anyone still paying attention: labor organizers and artists and shopkeepers, alongside the few remaining society families who decided the couple was more interesting than their scandal. Their first anniversary fell on a cold January day, and they celebrated by returning to Central Park, to the bench where Alexander had proposed. The city had moved on to new scandals, and they walked arm in arm through the snow-covered paths without attracting attention, just another couple enjoying a winter afternoon. "Do you regret it?" Clara asked as they sat together on their bench, watching the sun set over the frozen lake. "Giving up your place in society? The easy path?" Alexander pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. I regret wasting so many years living for other people's expectations. I regret not finding you sooner, but marrying you, choosing this life with you that I'll never regret." Clara leaned into his warmth, marveling at how strange life was. A year ago, she'd been a lonely seamstress with impossible dreams. And now she was a duchess, albeit a scandalous one, married to a man she loved who loved her in return. They'd faced obstacles and would undoubtedly face more. But they'd face them together, which made all the difference. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for being brave enough to choose something real over something expected." "Thank you for showing kindness to a stranger," Alexander replied, echoing the words that had started everything. "And for teaching me that the only life worth living is one built on genuine connection rather than social obligation." They sat together until the stars came out, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built something precious from the wreckage of abandoned expectations. And if society never quite forgave them, if Alexander's family never reconciled with their marriage, if whispers followed them wherever they went, well, they'd learned to care more about their own happiness than others' approval. 5 years later, Clara stood in the nursery of their brownstone, holding their newborn daughter and watching the spring rain patter against the windows. Alexander sat in the rocking chair beside her, their 3-year-old son asleep in his arms, and Clara marveled at the perfect ordinariness of the moment. "What should we name her?" Alexander asked softly, gazing at their daughter with wonder. "Hope," Clara said without hesitation. "Her name should be Hope, because that's what you gave me when I needed it most. Hope that life could be different, that love could be real, that impossible dreams sometimes come true." Alexander smiled, that rare, genuine smile that still made Clara's heart skip, and reached out to trace their daughter's tiny features with one finger. "Hope Bancroft. I like that. A name for a girl who'll grow up knowing she can choose her own path, regardless of what society expects." Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm, washing clean the streets where Clara had once struggled as a seamstress with impossible dreams. Inside, surrounded by the family they'd built through courage and choice, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here, from a rainy November night in an alley to this moment of perfect, ordinary joy. She thought about the girl she'd been, lonely and resigned to a small life. She thought about the bleeding stranger she'd helped without expecting anything in return. And she thought about all the impossible moments between then and now. The walks in Central Park, the scandal and ostracism, the slow building of a life based on genuine love rather than social calculation. "Tell me again," their son murmured sleepily from Alexander's arms. "Tell me the story about how you and Mama met." Alexander caught Clara's eye, and they shared a smile full of shared history and hard-won happiness. "Well," he began, his voice warm with the same affection he showed every time he told this story, "it was a cold, rainy night in November, and I was lost and hurt, and your mama found me and showed me that kindness, real, uncomplicated kindness, still existed in the world. And then you fell in love," their son said, as he always did. "And then I fell in love," Alexander confirmed, "with the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. And she loved me back, even though it made no sense and everyone said it was impossible. And that's the most important lesson I can teach you, son. Sometimes the impossible things, the things everyone says can't work, are exactly the things worth fighting for." Clara looked at her family, her husband who'd given up everything for love, her children who would grow up knowing they could choose their own paths, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. They'd built this life from nothing but courage and trust. They'd faced scandal and ostracism and family fury. But they'd survived it all because they'd chosen each other, freely and completely, every single day. Years later, When people asked Clara about her unlikely marriage to a duke, she always told them the same thing. I showed kindness to a stranger on a cold November night. And that stranger showed me that love, real, transformative, impossible love, is worth more than any amount of social approval or security. We built our life on that foundation, and it's held strong through everything. The story of the seamstress and the duke became something of a legend in New York, a cautionary tale for some, a romantic ideal for others. But for Clara and Alexander, it was simply their life, messy and imperfect and absolutely real. They'd both been trapped in different ways when they met. He by wealth and expectation, she by poverty and limited opportunity. And they'd freed each other, not through grand gestures but through daily choice, through the constant decision to choose love over comfort, truth over convenience, possibility over resignation. On their 10th anniversary, Clara published a small collection of her designs, a book that would eventually revolutionize how working women dressed in America. She dedicated it to Alexander, with words simple but profound. To the man who taught me that showing kindness to a stranger can change two lives forever. Thank you for being brave enough to love me when it was easier not to. And Alexander, reading those words in the comfort of their home with their children playing in the next room and spring sunshine streaming through the windows, felt the same gratitude he'd felt in that alley years ago when a young seamstress had stopped to help a bleeding stranger without asking for anything in return. Some love stories begin with passion and drama. Theirs had begun with simple kindness. One person seeing another's need and responding with compassion. And from that single moment, they'd built a life that proved impossible things could happen when two people were brave enough to choose each other over everything else. The newspapers eventually stopped writing about them. Society found new scandals to gossip about, but the life they'd built endured, not perfect but genuine, not easy but worth every sacrifice. Built on a foundation of kindness, shown on a cold November night when a seamstress found a wounded stranger and chose compassion over caution. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.